Hello, boys and girls. Here we are again. I thought I was going to be able to come in and be with you. Here I am in my mask, and we're still being careful. So Mrs. Deitz is going to have to do some filming again for you to watch on the screen. But one of these days, she's going to be able to come back with you. Now today, I want to talk, because this is our first time, I want to talk about the library. A library is a special place that we can go and get books of all kinds. And if you remember, some of you last year, Mrs. Deitz told you some stories that instead of reading a book, they came from her head, from her imagination. And we're going to call those Mimi's stories, because my grandchildren like me to do Mimi's stories. So today, I'm going to tell you a Mimi story. Now this story takes place a long time ago, before there were any TVs to watch, and before you had computers, and before there were even cell phones. So this was a good while ago. And there was a little girl that, as she got older, she found out that she liked to hear stories. And her mommy would tell her stories, and then her mommy would read her some stories. And one day, that little girl was in first grade, and she learned to read stories herself. And she just loved to take a book and read it. She could read about animals that talked and got dressed. She could read about Peter Rabbit. Or she could read true stories about people that grew up to be nurses and doctors and flew airplanes and did lots of things. So she would ask every Christmas or every birthday for books. And when she would get those books, she would sit and read. She had special places she would read. Sometimes she'd climb up in a tree and read her book up in a tree. Sometimes she would just go up to her bedroom all by herself. And when she was supposed to be asleep at night, she might be reading a book. Sometimes she would just go anywhere under a table in her house, and she would read a book. And one day, her mother said to her, "Little girl, I want you to come with me. We're going to take a little trip." Now, this was a very small town, and they didn't use the car. They walked. And they walked to this big building. And when they went in the big building, she looked all around. Her mother said, "Look, little girl." She looked up and she looked down. And everywhere she looked, all the way to the ceiling, there were books. And then she went into another room, and there were more books. And then she went up some steps, and there were still some more books. Well, this little girl didn't know which book to read first. And then her mother showed her something. She told her to pick out some books, and she took these books over to a lady that was behind a big desk. And the lady looked at the book, and in the back there was a card. And she took out that card, and on the card she wrote the little girl's name. And she said, "Little girl, you can take these books home, and you can read them. And then you bring them back in a week, and you can get some more books." This was the library. The little girl had found out what a library was. Well, every week she went back and she would get more books and she would read them. Sometimes she would read about faraway places in other countries and lands. Sometimes she would read books about animals. Sometimes she would read pretend books, or books about a family going on a trip. Or she might even read a book that was a mystery. And the little girl got older, and she could walk to the library all by herself. And she still would go to the library and get books and read them. And the little girl got older, and one day the little girl got married. And then the little girl had children of her own, and she used to hold those children on her lap and read them lots of stories. And then her children all were grown, and they were reading their own children's stories. But then the little girl had some grandchildren and some great-grandchildren that she could read stories to. But she didn't get to read those as often. And one day, there was a lady that said to the little girl, "Would you like to come and read stories at school for me?" So the little girl went to a school, and she read stories to the children. So she still got to read stories to children, and she loved it. That little girl, do you know who it was? That little girl was Mrs. Deitz. And now she gets to come and read stories to you in the preschool. And you have your own library in Miss Beth's office. Or you can go to the big Augusta County Library. Or you can have a library even in your home. Mrs. Deitz has a little library in her home. She has books, and she has places where she has shelves of books. And she likes to read them or let her grandchildren and children and great-grandchildren read them when they come to visit her. So today, we talked about the library. And the other thing at the library is you have to be really careful when you go to the library. If you borrow a book, you can't throw it on the floor, or you can't bend it. You have to be very gentle, because the book is a good friend, and it can give many people pleasures, and many people can get to read that book. Well, Mrs. Deitz is so glad to be back with you, and she will be seeing you now each week. And next week, we will read a story. But sometimes, we're going to have a Mimi story for you. Goodbye, and I'll see you again next week.